Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. The last time I was in Saskatchewan was prior to the 2010 Olympics. I was presenting for the Industry Canada on the business opportunities for the Olympic Games. And so that was 8 years ago, and it's a pleasure for me to be back here. And I took advantage of it to see a little bit of your beautiful province and spend some time with a friend of mine. And I was quite impressed with the way the economy is going here. I mean, we've been hearing, obviously, that Saskatchewan is doing well. But when my friend told me that we couldn't get a room at the spa in Moose Jaw in the middle of November, I was quite impressed, and apparently that's something that's happening all around Saskatchewan. You know, the hotel rooms are at a premium even in this season, which for tourism operators in our region, to have that problem in the middle of November, they would be extremely grateful. So very interesting to be here, and thank you for having me. So I am the CEO of the Island Coastal Economic Trust. In a nutshell, what we do is we fund community-driven economic development initiatives in targeted sectors to spark new and sustainable regional economic growth and diversification. So that's the pretty statement. We're guided by a team of more than 50 local leaders who collaborate to set regional priorities and build regional networks. How did this come about? It's a $50 million trust. We were endowed with $50 million by the province of BC in 2006. We were created by a legislation called the North Island Coast Development Initiative Trust Act. You can see why we changed our name to Island Coastal Economic Trust. It was just too challenging to say those words. The goal of this act was to diversify the trust region by making strategic investment in targeted sectors. We were given a number of sectors. You'll notice that the first sector we were given is economic development. So basically, we can invest in just about anything. There were 3 trusts that were created with a similar act. The Northern Development Trust received $185 million, and they have a much wider range of programs than we do. Is it echoing for you or just for me? You're all right? Okay. Initially, long story why they got a larger amount of money, but they have essentially been able to live from the interest on their fund. And they have a wide range of programs, including non-repayable grants, business support programs, loan guarantees, etc. And they've probably spent about twice the amount of money we've spent so far, but they've been able to do it on the interest. They have the opportunity with such a large fund to make very long-term investments and invest in equities and things like that. Whereas we got $50 million, our investment strategy is much more conservative, primarily in bond funds, in order to have access to the money in the short and medium term. We provide communities with non-repayable grants, and you'll find out a bit more about that. The ICET, the other trust that was created at the same time, is again a very different model, and they provide primarily loans to business, high risk, high interest. The majority of their loans are in the 14% interest range, and so they're working with a totally different ecosystem than we are. And that's one of the things here that's very interesting, is that with one legislation, there are minor differences in the 3 trusts legislation, but essentially it's the same piece of legislation. We all evolved with very, very different models, and those models were developed by the communities, by the regions, based on the economic landscape that they had at the time. So the region we cover, we have the island, Vancouver Island, but north of the Malahat, which means we don't include the capital region, which is Victoria, and the rural areas and the islands that are associated with the Capital Regional District. So any other Gulf islands or islands that are in our region are included in our trust. And we also have the Sunshine Coast, Powell River to Gibson's area. So normally the presentations I make are about our trust, what we do, how we invest our funds, what types of projects we've invested in, what the successes of those specific projects have been, and what our success metrics are from the investment point of view. But today I was asked to speak to you a little bit more about the governance, our model, because what we do is different from what you're going to be doing, but I think that we've had incredible success in regional cohesion, regional thinking, regional collaboration, and there are lessons that we can take out of there. So I'll focus a little bit more on our governance and less on our programs and our investments. So we have 2 regional advisory committees that provide advice to our board. We then have a board of directors that's made up of 13 members, and 4 are elected from each of our regional advisory committees, and 5 are provincial appointees. So basically, it's a bottom-up approach to economic development investment decision-making. The 2 regional advisory committees, we have the Central South Island region, which has 14 members, North Island Sunshine Coast, which has 30 members. They're all of the locally elected officials, including mayors, regional district chairs, and MLAs for the region. So each of the communities has 1 representative, and in our model, they can't send substitutes. So whoever is part of the group keeps coming back. It's always the same person. The mayor, regional district chair, or the MLAs participate, although they cannot be elected to our board. They meet approximately 2 to 4 times per year based on the volume of projects that we'll be working on. The role of the RACs, which is what we call our regional advisory committees, is to provide strategic advice to the board. What they do is we have our core business is granting funds for economic investment. Tell you a bit more about that later. And they're the first step in the process where they provide the ground truthing for the applications regarding eligibility, local support, and the value of the projects to the region. And so what they do is they provide advice to the board. They also elect the 8 board members, and they are the liaison with the communities. So they're the voice and ears for the board of directors, which will make the final decisions on behalf of the organizations. And we also have each RAC chair sit on the board of directors ex officio. So they can contribute to discussions, they just don't have a vote when it comes to voting. We have 13 board members, and 8 are elected every 3 years by the RAC members, and 5 are appointed by the province for 2-year terms. Just if you're developing a new organization, major flaw in this model is that after 6 years, I could lose my entire board. So if the provincial appointees change and none of my municipal leaders are re-elected, I could wind up with no one. Fortunately, that hasn't happened. And as Mayor Corrigan told you, we just had elections, which sets my heart beating. I wasn't involved in municipal politics prior to this job and never really paid much attention to municipal elections except in my own community, but now every community's election matters quite a bit. So, for example, this year we will have 2 board members who have not had their terms renewed. And so 2 mayors that were not re-elected, so we will have to go back to the RACs and re-elect two new board members. And we also have 2 that did not run for re-election. So half of my elected members will be changing, and we'll be having elections in January, February to determine the new members of the board. So they're the exclusive decision maker for the operations and investments. They meet 8 to 12 times per year. And we have incredible attendance and participation at our board meetings. And I think that's one of the success factors, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And we also have incredible attendance from our regional advisory committees. The larger one, which has 30 members, we typically have 28 people show up when we have our meetings and participate. And I'll tell you a little bit more later also about how we get incredible participation even from the communities that aren't really able to take full advantage of the fund yet because of where they are in their capacity. It's been a very good tool for all of them, and you could phone up any one of our board members and ask them as political people, what is their favorite board, and ICET is it. I mean, obviously what we do is perhaps a little bit more sexy, the type of projects that we handle, than some of the other matters that they would handle. And I don't know, I've never been in waste management, but I was thinking, you know, maybe that was maybe one of the less interesting ones. But they love our board. They love the experience that they have with the other leaders. And it's actually a very coveted position to be elected to our board. And our board is very well respected by the region, by the provincial government. And we also have had, and this we don't have control over, but we've had longevity. We've had mayors there who, we're going on about 7-8 years now of actual operations, and we've had mayors that have been there since the beginning, a few of them, and we have several that have been there a long time. So that really helps with the cohesion of the model. As far as staffing, we have a nimble, flexible staffing model, a core staff of 2, and expert consultants. We have a CFO and financial management team that's on contract. We use an economist, communications person, and specific due diligence where we need it. The first strategic plan, how did our organization decide to go with the model that it decided to go with? Had a roundtable strategic planning session, a 2-day retreat at Mount Washington. And it was really a bottom-up process, broad stakeholder participation, including the board, the RACs, the local economic development, industry, business, provincial government, experts. And it's important to mention this because our legislated model is what I've told you, the board and the RACs, and it's primarily elected officials. But that group of people decided that when it was time to make our strategic plan, we needed to involve the broader stakeholder group. And so we had presentations from experts in a number of industries and areas to talk about the economy, to talk about priorities. And the roundtable developed recommendations, and then from those recommendations, the board developed strategy, programs, and policies for the investment of that $50 million. So what was decided in our region is with $50 million, to invest only the interest, we would have been putting, you know, at today's interest rates of 3-4%, we would have been putting just a few $1 million out in the economy on an annual basis. And our region had a very large need for major infrastructure, economic infrastructure projects. And so it was decided that the best thing to do was to put the money to work on the ground in the communities rather than have it working in our bank account and not putting much back into the communities. So that way the communities were benefiting, business was benefiting, industry was benefiting, and the provincial government was also benefiting with tax income. So our mission is to be a partner and catalyst to build a diverse and sustainable island and coastal economy. And you know, as you can see in our values, integrity, accountability, transparency, collaboration. Our original objectives were a bit narrower than what they are today. So essentially, government gave us money to invest in economic development, and our board took its role as a funding mechanism, as you can see through the original vision. And it was to leverage economic development and diversification and investment in our economy, and that preference would be given to partnerships with a bias for projects that have a broad regional impact. So from the get-go, the idea, the concept of regional thinking was built into our model, and you'll see it also in some other policies. Just to show you a bit of the evolution during that time, these are our current objectives. So we're still leveraging investing, but we also recognize that to do that well, you need to improve the environment that you need for increased investment attraction and job creation. And that we do a lot of initiatives that work towards improving that environment. And then advancing regional collaboration and planning. That's what we consider now one of our key goals, is not only that we are regional collaboration, but we are there to ensure that the region and other groups, we try to facilitate that and encourage that and really focus on that. So we have 2 primary grant programs. Initially, we only had the Economic Infrastructure Program, and it was a 2-stage process only. Now you can get a maximum of $400,000. Initially, the maximum was $5 million. Now, we have to step back to the context. At the time, the provincial economy was doing quite well, and the island not so well, because we'd had a number of closures. And being an island, transportation infrastructure was very important, and as you all know, very expensive items. So we ended up in the first few years putting a lot of money into regional airports and harbors and that type of tourism and transportation infrastructure, which is quite expensive to put in. But after a few years, with the change in the economy, our maximum came down and our guidelines changed. We've also since developed a shorter process for smaller applications. And then in recent years, we've developed the Economic Development Readiness Program, which is a continuous intake, one-step, time-sensitive process. So in the Economic Infrastructure Program, in the two-stage process, the first stage is the projects go to the regional advisory committees, and they provide the advice to the board as to whether the board should approve those projects. They will look at the strength of the applicant, whether the region is on board with this project, and they'll give us the positives and the negatives. For example, we've had them say, no, this is a totally consultant-driven project. There's absolutely no community interest in this. Or, and I remember one regional advisory committee meeting where we brought a project forward, and one of the members stood up and said, over my dead body is that train going from Port Alberni, from Was to Port Alberni, and it was, whoa, and we had never seen that coming because we were not aware of those dynamics. So those are the types of things that the Regional Advisory Committee can do. And then the board will then look at the staff due diligence on the project and the validity of the project. It will look at the Regional Advisory Committee's recommendation, and then it will also look at broader policy considerations. And for example, there are some types of projects that if we open the door to them, we're going to get hundreds of applications and the fund will be depleted within months. So, sometimes there's broader policy applications that come into play. Some of the other activities that we're involved in is we provide economic analysis to the region. We have an economic dashboard with regional stats. And then we also provide detailed regional economic analysis, but with an island lens. So we all have access to the provincial or the national interpretation of certain statistics, but we all know that those statistics can have a very different meaning in different parts of the country or different parts of the region. And then we also do select economic pieces to debunk some of the economic myths in the region. So part of our goal is also to raise the level of economic development, understanding and literacy in the region, and not just in our membership. So for example, one of the more recent pieces we did is called Voting with Their Feet, Actual Quality of Life Rankings in Canada. And that was taking a bit of a stab at the Money Sense rankings, which had several of the island communities as the worst places in the world to live in, or in Canada to live in. And so we just took stats and we said, okay, well, where in Canada are people moving? And within Canada, what's the migration? And then we did a ranking of where Canadians are actually moving. And our analysis was that, the best place to live is what people choose based on a number of factors. And the economy is one and quality of life is another. And so we've also done some on youth retention and attraction in our region. There's a myth out there that Vancouver Island doesn't attract younger residents and that we're losing everyone, and that's actually not true. And and another one about another type of national ranking that came out that was showing that our communities are lacking in entrepreneurship. And we just took a different look and showed some different things. So we do some of that. That's what, if you go to our website, you can see what our dashboard looks like. It looks like that. We also have been doing in the last few years a lot more sharing of best practices and success stories. And we've ramped up our communications, our annual report. We do a lot of stories on our annual report, media stories, news releases. We use Facebook, we use our website. And the idea here is not just to pat ourselves on the back, but it's to help the region understand exactly what it is we're doing and why we're doing it, which also helps them then accept the decisions that their communities are making because they understand the broader economic concepts behind it. And so this is an example from this year's annual report where we profiled the Wild Pacific Trail. And anyone who's ever been on the west coast of Vancouver Island, if you've gone to Ucluelet, there's a magnificent trail called the Wild Pacific Trail, and that was one of the projects that we invested in early on, and we've invested again in another phase. And Ucluelet used to be a small fishing village that was basically in the shadow of Tofino. Tofino's always attracted people because of the national park. And through the development of this trail, the region was able to leverage some investment into their economy with resort development. And what started out as the community negotiating with for the right to build the trail along all of these properties, it has turned around now where the investors are asking the community to build the trail so that they can then invest. So so often people will be very negative about tourism and the impacts of tourism and its minimum level jobs and things like that. But for the small communities in our region, diversification to tourism has had the impact of attracting investment, attracting new residents, improving the community infrastructure, improving transportation to the community, and it's had a lot of very positive impacts on the region. So those are the types of things that we'll highlight that we're doing. So we have two primary programs, the economic infrastructure and the economic development readiness. And if you go on our website, you can take a look at some of the projects that we funded and some of the categories of things that we fund. So the projects we fund have to be consistent with local, regional, provincial strategies. They have to have incremental economic growth and diversification impacts. They have to value regional cooperation and economic environmental sustainability, and we want to be the tipping point. In the sense that if a project costs $4 million and they've already got $3.9 million, they don't need our $100,000. So we will try to fund projects where communities or nonprofit groups are not able to get the funding that they need. And that's our incremental piece, and that we're incremental to the region. We're not just doing what someone else would have done. We're trying to be the piece that makes things happen. So one of the areas where we've had quite a bit of impact is in tourism, and our communities were primarily resource-based, a lot of our communities, and had gone through a terrible time even before the economic downturn, with the closure of sawmills and the withdrawal of some of the those parent companies that were the focus of those communities. So tourism has been, sort of the lowest hanging fruit for a lot of the communities to begin their diversification process. We're now moving beyond that in a lot of communities, but that's an example of an area where we've done a very large number of things, and we've done visitor amenities, marine tourism, visitor centers, trails. So one of the things that's interesting about our program is that we have a unique matching funding formula which recognizes variance in economic vitality, and we have a sliding scale approach to matching funding. So we had our economists look at our communities and establish their rankings. So the communities with significant economic challenges, such as rural and remote resource-dependent communities, are eligible for one-to-one funding, which means that we'll give them up to $1 for every dollar that they put into a project. 1 to 2 is for smaller but thriving communities, and 1 to 3, those are the faster growing and less resource-dependent communities, like Nanaimo, for example, if you know the island at all. And as far as eligible applicants, we don't fund just communities. First Nations are eligible. The nonprofits and basically any organization involved in economic development or any nonprofit that's doing a project that has incremental economic benefits can apply to our fund. And one of the things which I didn't mention earlier is that our board of directors, we don't have, in our legislation, we don't have a mandated First Nations presence, but we do have 2 First Nations members of our board who've been there since inception. And that's very, very important to us. And when we went through our, what was it called? We had a legislative review that we had to do after 5 years. One of the primary recommendations that came about as far as changes needed to our legislation was that they legislate First Nations on our regional advisory committees. We actually have 1 First Nation that can participate because it is a local government, but other than that, the other First Nations don't. If you go back historically, why this wasn't done, it's because at the same time, the province also funded a First Nations Development Trust. But regardless of that, to keep us separate in silos, it doesn't make sense in today's economic context. On Vancouver Island, we have 53 First Nations, and we have 3 language groups, the Nuu-chah-nulth, the Kwakwala, and the Coast Salish. And increasingly, economic development is happening in partnership with the First Nations. And that's a piece that's been very, very important to our regional advisory committees. And this has been even before the Silcotin decision or any of these more recent decisions that have had everyone saying, okay, we need to work with First Nations. For example, we had the geoscience organization approached us for funding to help fund some geoscience exploration on northern Vancouver Island. And the northern communities are very much on board with mining as an economic opportunity. And that's one of the economic myths we need to bust, because there are some areas on the island where mining isn't wanted, and the communities have very valid reasons. But there are other areas where communities do want mining. But the first thing that the community said, even before they came to us, is the First Nations have to be on board. So what we did as part of our approval process is after the stage 1, we said there has to be a formal work in collaboration with the First Nations to ensure that they are included in this entire geoscience exploration process. Because otherwise we won't be funding it. And then they came back and it wasn't to our taste, and we sent it back and we said, no, this is not substantial enough. It needs to be more genuine. So our communities are and have been very much aware of the need to work with First Nations, and that's something that's been growing. And you'll see more and more of our projects and our communities have economic collaborations with First Nations. And so these are a few examples of the infrastructure projects. The Kinsel Trestle, which was restored, the Ucluelet Aquarium, one of my favorite projects, really fun little aquarium there. The Nanaimo Visitor Center, the North Coast Trail, the Fanny Bay Harbor. That was a really interesting one where we invested in some harbor infrastructure. And instantly, the shellfish aquaculture sector, some of the businesses came to us and told us that it was like winning the lottery for them because it had enabled them to basically double their business because of the productivity that this had allowed them to gain. So, and again, the credit doesn't come to us. The credit goes to every community, every nonprofit group that has put these projects out on the ground. But it's been interesting to be able to be a part of this and to be supporting all of these communities. There you have the Deep Bay Field Research Station. You have the Homalco Wildlife Tours. You have the Alert Bay Walkway and Walkways. And you have the Sunshine Coast Trail, which is the longest hut-to-hut hiking trail in all of Canada. And there was the work on the Nanaimo Airport. So that's a bit of a cross-section of some of the smaller remote projects, large community projects that we've been involved in funding. So if you take a look at our key metrics, we've been able to leverage about $268 million from the original $50 million. 50 people working together. So far we've committed over $48 million. 44 has actually gone out the door and is in the ground in communities working. This generates about $10.4 million per year in provincial government revenue once the projects are operational. We have about 36% of our funds which have gone into smaller communities. We now have over 125 different projects, and those are the jobs that were created, the short term and the long term. And if you're interested in just this basic information, I have some postcards up here that you can come and take at your leisure. And I also have some pamphlets that explain our basic programs. So the evolution of the model, I'm just going to take a quick look at the time here. Early on, there was a bit of jockeying for position. Some of the larger communities came in with a bit of an attitude. And I wouldn't say it was because they were larger communities. I think it was more about the personalities on the board at that time. The board was legislated, the first board. But everything was positioned for a regional approach. And so something happened in the translation of the PowerPoint. The arrows moved, but there are a few projects we'd like to forget that were done initially, and with hindsight comes a lot of vision, and often some of those projects we'd like to forget were some that were done for smaller communities that didn't have much capacity, and they came in with projects that really were probably not great long-term regional economic development projects, but everyone felt so guilty, so bad about the fact that the larger communities were so well positioned to take advantage of the fund, and the smaller, more remote communities that didn't have a lot of capacities weren't. That in the beginning, they said yes to these projects. But then that quickly changed, and the capacity at the local level also really improved quite a bit. So what happened, how did that change happen, is with collegiality came empathy. With empathy came a stronger understanding of the issues for the entire region. And with that understanding came the support and the call to action of the have communities that were doing better economically, using their resources and knowledge and contacts to support the smaller communities. And also, the development of our own identity as a regional organization was key. We are ICET, and when people come to us, they're ICET. They're not Nanaimo or Zeballos or Port McNeill. They're ICET. And so we've had, I'd say, loss of parochialism completely, with a few exceptions. We've had, usually I'd say, one board member per term that just isn't able to really come in, and that board member often doesn't get reelected. To echo what Mayor Corrigan was saying, I don't know what I did there, is that the regional thinkers and the bridge builders are the ones that the regional advisory committees elect to the board. And if those people don't perform in that way on the board, then they're not re-elected to the board. And so we've had tremendous stability at our board, because I think the regional advisory committees have made very good choices for our board. They've chosen the people that can lead the organization forward. And it's not just the people, the power brokers, if you want to call them, the people in the larger communities that have that much more access to government. But they've also, for example, elected to our board last term the mayor of Zeballos, the smallest community in our region, 100 and some people, because that guy was a bridge builder, doing great things with the First Nations in his region, collaboration, and he wanted to learn, and that's how he was elected to the board. They also gave him the opportunity to go on the board, to bring his vision to the board, but also to allow him to learn. So we've had that type of dynamic, and I didn't have much experience with municipal politics, and to be totally frank, when I started in this job, I was a bit afraid of 50 people fighting over one pot of money, and it's been the opposite of the preconceived notion that I have and that other people have. And often people will listen to me and roll their eyes and think that I'm lying about the type of agreement that we have, but I'm not. I'm telling you, it is true. These people, they take off their local hats and they put on their regional hat when they come onto our board. And what it leads to is, because everyone is a part of the decision-making process for almost every dollar that goes out our door, they accept the decisions. And so some of the small communities have had very little access to the fund because of their capacity level. But they show up all the time and they take part in the decision making. And it makes them a true regional partner in that sense. And they understand that they're not ready to access the funding, but they've been growing. And I'd encourage you to read about the Sayward example, and that's a perfect example, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. So what's also happening is that this growth of regional thinking is also spreading to other organizations in the region. Whoop, wrong button. So some of the unexpected impacts, as I said, initially we started out as an organization that was there to grant funding, but we've seen a great growth in regional economic collaboration, increased learning and sharing of best practices, increased economic literacy in communities. It's amazing where that has gone from, even just I started the trust in 2010, and just in the time that I've been there, it's phenomenal the change that we've seen in that. And the increase in economic development capacity, and what we have now is a shared vision and regional cohesion. And it's not all on paper, but it's there in the way people act and conduct themselves. So our second program, the Economic Development Readiness Program, was born out of the desire to help increase capacity because we had some significant capacity issues in some of our smaller communities, where people couldn't even do economic development off the corner of their desk because they were doing everything else off the corner of their desk. And so we put together a program to support readiness, so basic strategic planning for communities that don't have it, or to allow other communities, wherever they are on the economic development continuum, to come in and get funding to help build the tools that they need to attract investment to the region. And that program also specifically supports regional marketing and regional economic collaboration, because often it's something that's difficult for individual communities to fund a regional approach because they're limited, to spending their funds locally. So you can also go and take a look at some of the projects that we funded on our website. And so I will skip the actual story of Sayward, but I'd encourage you to read it. It was a community suffered greatly from the downturn, sat at the table for about 6 years before they decided that they needed to develop a strategy. They learned an incredible amount from the other people at the table, and then they were able to get the expertise that they needed, got a strategy. Within a few months of having their strategy completed, were able to attract an investor that was, very much buoyed by the fact that the community had this preparation and this confirmation of their principles. And now things are just like taking off. It was very interesting. So what are the key success factors on the road to regional thinking? What has worked for us? And we were created by government, we're accountable to government. Even though we're arm's length, I think the accountability helps, and we're vertically integrated with the government. So, provincial government staff network with me on an ongoing basis to find out what's happening in our region and what they can be doing. So that's a great addition to our model, is the fact that we have that. Long-term funding strategy allows you to maintain your independence. You're not dependent on political cycles. We all know that when elections get close, all of a sudden there's lots of funding, then things close down. So this allows us to be independent of the provincial election cycles. Ideally, we would like to have, a sustainable fund. We're not there yet, but trying to work on that. So it's also a mechanism for us to raise awareness about economic development issues with government without necessarily having to lobby. Our organization has decided that we are not a lobby organization. We leave that to the individual municipalities, to AVICC and other municipal bodies to do lobbying. So we lobby just kind of at this level, internally, but not externally. So we have a strong governance model. And I think that it's inclusive of all locally elected officials. First Nations are part of our model, as I mentioned, unfortunately not through the legislation, but in practice, and it will stay that way. We will insist on having appointees, making sure that we have proper First Nations representation. And the First Nations that we have on our board are great. They're very knowledgeable of economic development, and they're very well connected, and they're very well respected in our region and on our board. And it's very important for us to have that connection and to have that ground truthing, you know, for initiatives to ensure that they are respectful of the First Nations and inclusive of First Nations economic development. I mentioned the right people being elected and the checks and balances in our system. I think you have to have in your governance model some level of checks and balances. And for us, it's the provincial appointees. So sometimes when the locally elected leaders get overly passionate, which some people would call parochial, but I really think that in most times they're really passionate about what they're doing. The provincial appointees are far more removed, and they're able to step in and say, you know, great, but you know, here's the other picture. Strong leadership. Your chair has to be willing to do the right thing, and I've been very fortunate to work with strong chairs, very ethical chairs, that are willing to make the tough decisions that do not make them popular amongst their peers at times. And that's very, very important in order to maintain the integrity of your organization and your reputation outside the community. So communities sometimes don't like the decisions we make, and I have the lovely job of advising them that they're not getting funding from us. But they respect it, and they respect the fact that our board does follow its precedents and is fair in the decision-making process. So in that sense, I think that that's a key piece that you need to have. Strong leadership, and you have to have staff also that are willing to stand up and make controversial recommendations when you know that, you know, the municipal elected leaders and the people who control your job and your paycheck may not like what you have to say, but you have to say it. And so you have to have leadership at both of those executive levels. And longevity, corporate memory supports strong leadership. We have people on our board who can say, you know, well, yeah, we decided that years ago, but it was a totally different concept, and the reason was, and they know those things. So you're able to maintain integrity and continuity in your decision making. The fact that it's a bottom-up and place-based strategy, you know, the community can't say, well, why are you guys investing your funds this way? They all sat at the table and decided how we were going to invest the funds. It's a unique program with a place-based strategy, but we have clear strategic goals and a work plan, and that's very important for our organization. And I think sometimes some regional organizations will fail because they're seen as more ad hoc type models, and they don't have the structure that allows them to become, you know, long-term. So I think that that's important to have that. The fact that we have ground truthing and meaningful involvement of our regional advisory committees, they are on board with everything because we truly consult them. They truly have an impact on the process. And the board will rarely overturn their decisions. They've never said yes to a project that the communities didn't want, the RACs didn't want. They have sometimes said no to projects that the RACs have recommended, but for broader policy reasons. And the result is we have this unconditional buy-in from our regional advisory committees. And regardless of whether, you know, they've gotten the funding they wanted on the projects they wanted, we continue to work with them to ensure that, you know, if we say no this time, let's see what else we can work on and to bring you to the table next time. We have had a clear and limited focus, and that's been very successful for us. We recognize that we can't be everything to everyone, and we've sometimes had pressure to go into other areas. And I have to say that as a staff member, I come in and I've got these great ideas, and I come to the board and we should do this and we should do this. And the board has been very focused in bringing me back and telling me, no, this is what we have chosen to do, and we're going to do it well, rather than try to spread our resources too thin. So our focus, our mission is clearly understood by everyone, and we limit our focus to what is achievable. And I think that's very important also. because if you embark on very ambitious initiatives that are not achievable, especially early on, it will be very difficult afterwards to maintain your credibility and your momentum, and people will get discouraged because there are no results. So especially in the beginning, you know, just try to focus on things that are achievable. And you know, I believe in staying fairly small. Our board philosophy was not to create another level of government. We have a very lean staff, which has allowed us to change our staffing and our positions and bring in contractors on a part-time basis for different things. And it's allowed us to be very nimble and to change very quickly. And I would tell you, regardless of regional model or not, as the way the economy is going, and when I listen to futurists and economists, I think that, you know, all of our organizations are going to have to be a lot more nimble because things are changing far more quickly in the economic development landscape than they did in previous generations. We have a unique identity which is separate from the member local governments. And we, especially in the last 2 years, have been fostering the public image of our identity. Identity development, it does take time and it takes a certain amount of resources. And, but one of the things that has been key for us is that the fact that our board meets in person very often, it's really helped to reinforce the identity. One of the other models, the Southern Development Trust, has a lot of their meetings online, and they have a little bit more disconnect with the relationship building piece of it. There are some parts of the region that don't participate. And so we have incredible participation, and I think that this is the thing, relationships, and Mayor Corrigan said it, you know, it's built on the relationships, and for that you have to be able to see people. We also have a very safe and respectful environment. The confidentiality of our decision-making process is strongly enforced, and it's similar to what you would do in your communities in camera. And the reason for that is that if our board decisions are played out in the media, people will not stand up and make the right decision. And I have seen so many mayors come in, you know, and they're the regional advisory committee or even at the board level, and they're ready to pitch their community project and tell us about all the great things it's going to do for their community. And then we open up the project and we show them the guts, right? That's our role as staff, to say, okay, you know, these are the pieces that are there, these are the pieces that are, you know, maybe not quite right. And then they're able to recognize for themselves that the project either is not good or is not ready. And they are able to vote down projects from their own communities because it's done in an in-camera, in a confidential process. And then the RACs don't own any decisions because they're recommendations. The board owns all decisions. And it's taboo for, you know, someone to say, you know, you'll have a board, you know, a community member say, hey, you know, Jerry, what happened with that project? Why didn't you guys fund it? Well, Jerry's not going to say, well, it's Mayor so-and-so. He just, you know, he talked the whole board out of it, or it's the staff, or it's whatever. Everything, the board owns all of its decisions. And so that has allowed us to have our decision-making out of the media, out of the whole election validation process for the mayors. So that's something that has been very good for us. And one thing we try to do is you know, ensure that there's a context that allows for congeniality. And for us, that means good food, a pleasant room, good lighting, the ability to come in a little earlier and chat with people and have food set out. So, you know, we try to make sure that that atmosphere is there. Well-resourced, that's very important. Professional staffing provides corporate memory, continuity for an organization like that. And you don't want your staff to be flipping over all the time. You want to be able to access people that have the expertise that you need. And municipal officials, you're all so busy. There's only so many limits that can be made on your time. So my role, you know, is to ensure that I get from what I need from the board for direction, but I try not to put too much on their shoulders. And so that's been successful too, in that they can come in and do what they do best, which is provide us with the vision at 20,000 feet and at ground level. and then, you know, not have to spend too much of their time on things that we should be doing. And then, you know, long-term funding, a sustainable model would be great. Northern Trust has it. We don't. We're trying to get more funding from the province. We're not there yet, but we're going to keep trying. You know, in the academic world, they call some of what we're doing strategic doing, which is working towards a common purpose. With active involvement, you get more compromise than you would. If you're planning a vacation, your dream vacation, your plan's not going to be the same as if you're planning your vacation on your $5,000 or $2,000 or $300 budget. And so you come to more practical, pragmatic decisions often when you're actually working on something real with the ability to implement what it is that you're doing. And you have to have flexibility to adapt to reality. You know, that's also one of the things we've noticed. We're trying to build a collaborative ecosystem. So obviously we have the carrot and the stick. We have $50 million. Let's not lure ourselves. That is a very important motivator to get people to sit down and talk together. It's also a motivator for the regions. So when we talk about economic development funding, our board has sometimes said, no, we can't fund that. Now, if it was a collaborative approach, we could fund it. And for economic development readiness, same thing. There are, for example, two communities that want to do the same thing, and they're side by side, and it could be done collaboratively. We can't fund both of them to compete against each other. We can only fund them if they want to work together. And and so they may choose to go separately, but we have the ability to try to broker that collaboration, and we do it in a lot of projects. And then we also support regional collaborative learning events and other collaborative organizations in their work. Open to learning and change. We're always willing to share our best practices and looking for other best practices. And that's what happens at our table on an ongoing basis. We also look back, look forward, and then every once in a while, we're innovative, and I say that with a bit tongue-in-cheek because in general, this context is the municipal context is not a wild and crazy world. Decisions are usually fairly conservative. And so sometimes it's good to push the envelope a little bit and to take a little bit of risk where there's a high possibility of reward. And so that's something that we've done and we've been very successful with in a few areas where the board really went out on a limb. And then evaluate is very important. You have stakeholders, you have funders. If you're able to evaluate your performance, measure it, and speak out about it, it's also much easier to continue to get more funding. And celebrating what you've been doing well out in the media. And we are a Facebook, Twitter, whatever world now. And you need to know that if you're not participating in those mediums, whatever they are, to broadcast your success, people, the next generation coming up, won't really know what you're about. And it's better to tell your story on your terms than to have someone else telling your story with what they understand of it. And I find that celebrating success breeds success. Every time, in the last 2 years, we've heightened our communications approach, and every time a story comes out, it'll get picked up sometimes by the CBC, sometimes by local media, and then we get calls from other people, other applicants. Even some of the regional advisory committees go, oh, I didn't realize that this was what was happening there. And it's changing the way people perceive things, because these types of stories don't usually get picked up by the media, the economic development success stories. So I wanted to close by showing you what our vision for the future is. And look at those 4 things. I think that it applies to probably any community, anywhere. And so this is a good starting point to find areas of collaboration and cohesiveness. And then in conclusion, regional thinking, it's a result, it takes time, and it's built, like Mayor Corrigan said, on relationships and on people.
and it's a result of the seeds you sow, the environment you foster. And I'm going to pick, collaboration with First Nations. Unless you've started working on that years ago, no matter what you do in your strategic plan today, it's not going to happen overnight. This is a long-term collaboration, and it's the same thing with all the communities. So if you speak, as Mayor Corrigan said, in regional terms, and you value regional collaboration, it's going to come back to you. And so I don't know, I think I might have exceeded the time for questions.